Thank you, Andy, and everybody. Really appreciate your coming out. It's a pleasure to have a chance to talk on my favorite subject to people who presumably are really interested in that subject. That's wonderful. First, I'd like to introduce Chris Downs. Chris, would you just stand up for a second? So Chris Downs is from AMT, which is the Association for Manufacturing Technology. And the refreshments, and I guess they're continuing to bring out more things, right, are courtesy of AMT. So all of you who are enjoying a coffee, it's Chris and his organization brought them out. AMT puts on IMTS, the International Manufacturing Technology Show, which is in Chicago every 2 years. And it'll be this year in September. And that event is the largest manufacturing show in the Americas. And they anticipate that this year they will have 121,000 attendees, which will match the record previously set in 1998. So that's to say that we want to revitalize America, but AMT at least is doing a real good job of getting that started. So we appreciate AMT's support. Thank you, Chris. I've got a couple of questions for you, and this is going to help me understand where you are, which will help me understand how to customize what I do during the presentation. So who believes that it's essential to dramatically grow U.S. manufacturing? Hands? Anybody? Okay, so we got mostly what I call the choir. Okay, that's good. What percentage increase do you think we need to achieve? So 5% increase in manufacturing output. Raise your hand when we get to a number you think is a good number. 10%? 20%? Okay, for number 20 is 30%. 1, 2, 40%. Yeah, okay. So I'm going to show you that 40% is achievable. Okay, this is going to take some work, but it is achievable. Who believes that a much smaller trade deficit is an essential part of the solution? Maybe half, something like that. Okay, we're going to deal with that. Who believes we can add millions of manufacturing jobs by reducing the trade deficit? Okay, maybe a quarter of you. Okay, I'm going to dig into that pretty hard. Okay, it gives me a good feeling for where you are, and I'd say you're about halfway to where I am. So I hope when I'm done, you're maybe 3/4 of the way to where I am. But I'm also happy at the end of this with questions and afterward with discussions to hear your viewpoints on the entire subject. Since I'm the founder of the Reshoring Initiative, naturally, reshoring is going to turn out to be one of the keys to revitalizing U.S. manufacturing. And so a couple of definitions that relate to it. First, offshoring is sourcing products abroad that will be sold or assembled here. So if GM goes and builds a factory in China and sells in China, we don't call that offshoring. But if they go there and they build cars there and they ship them back here, that's been offshored. Reshoring, backshoring, onshoring, insourcing, all those are really essentially the same terms. They all refer to bringing back to the U.S. and producing, once again, products that will be sold or assembled here. FDI, I refer to frequently, foreign direct investment. It's a similar logic. So when GM decides to make an engine here again instead of Mexico, it's because they decide it's more profitable to do that. When Toyota decides to make a car here for the U.S. instead of making it in Japan and shipping it here, they've decided it's more profitable for them to make it here instead of there. So they follow exactly the same logic. The only difference between reshoring and FDI is where the parent company is located. A lot of people talk about localization. It's a popular strategy by companies. It says increasingly produce near the consumer. So Caterpillar, for example, might produce in China for Asia, in the U.S. for North America, maybe in Brazil for South America, maybe Germany for Europe, rather than producing each product in one location and shipping it all over the world. So there's a trend towards localization. Nearshoring is sourcing in Mexico or Canada to supply the U.S. market. So, for example, instead of producing in China and shipping here, source in Mexico, or more likely, or Canada, and ship into the U.S. market. That's nearshoring. Nearshoring for me is better than China because the product that comes out of Mexico is typically about 40% U.S. content, whereas the product that comes out of China is maybe 5% U.S. content. So when you get it back to Mexico, you got about half growth, better than no growth. Of all these trends, all this discussion, the U.S. is potentially the biggest beneficiary because we were the biggest loser because we've lost so much to offshore that as we reverse that trend and bring it back, we have the most to gain. And my purpose is to challenge some of those beliefs to the extent that you weren't quite at the position I am on these things. I hope you'll move towards my view to demonstrate how that the need to grow manufacturing percentage of GNP is high, the importance of a smaller goods trade deficit, that importing less is easier than exporting more. And those are the two ways to reduce the trade deficit. You either import less or you export more. It's much easier to import less. To document the success we've had so far with reshoring and FDI, which shows that it is possible to bring back large numbers of jobs, but that there are limits to that success. And we'll show you what those limits are, and then propose actions to overcome those limits, to remove those limits, including some alternatives to tariffs. A lot of the discussion now is about tariffs, and I'm not here to oppose tariffs, but to suggest there are other alternatives that might be more effective in the long run. To overcome some myths that hinder the actions that we're describing, and to prove that now is the time to act. So this chart, the red line, shows the trend in manufacturing as a percentage of GDP. And you can see it's gone from about 30% in 1970 to about 15%, or maybe 12, 13% today. So it's been cut in half as a percentage of the GDP. And that's a little bit because we consume fewer goods and more services, but it's more so because we're importing more and manufacturing less here. So that's, and our view is that if we're going to continue to be the technology leader of the world, if we're going to be the arsenal of democracy, fulfill our traditional role for the last 40, 50 years, that's not consistent with a manufacturing percentage of GDP that declines and continues to decline. And I couldn't get any top economist to tell me at what percentage the decline is irreversible and we collapse, but it inevitably will. And so I'd say we're awfully far now and shouldn't go any lower and should come up dramatically. So to go into that a little deeper, you can say, well, the developed countries typically don't manufacture as much as the developing countries do that. We do the services. But even compared to the average of the other developed countries in the world, where manufacturing is 3 percentage points lower as a percentage of our GDP. So we're not even a good developed world country. When manufacturing declines, innovation declines. Professors Pisano and Shi at Harvard Business School have proven that when you separate engineering from manufacturing, innovation declines. And when you bring it back together, innovation improves. So we can't be an innovation country unless we're significantly a manufacturing country. And as our manufacturing declines, our companies are not as busy, the capacity utilization is lower, they don't invest as much in people and equipment, and therefore productivity doesn't rise. So if your productivity doesn't rise, you can't increase your wages, you can't be competitive. Another way of looking at it is that the cumulative trade deficit, since we started to have trade deficits around 1970, is $11.6 trillion, so trillion with a T, which is equal to the value of the NASDAQ stock exchange, most of the high-tech companies, and is about 2/3 of the total home equity in the country. So it's a really big number. So foreigners, foreign countries, foreign companies holding that $11.6 trillion have a call on our assets. In theory, they could come in and buy the NASDAQ and take it all, and instead of us, us individually, they would own the whole thing. Not a good thing. Eventually, if things continue, the dollar will collapse. It hasn't done so yet with the reserve currency, et cetera. But eventually, if the manufacturing continues to decline, the trade deficit continues to grow, eventually the dollar will collapse. And so we're suggesting an alternative to that. To me, probably the scariest thing is that our self-sufficiency in goods is about 23%. So of all the items, the goods, products, things that our companies and our consumers consume, 77% are imported. We produce 23% of it. So think of everything you consume, and 3/4 of it we don't make here. So imagine a time when natural disaster, political instability, trade disputes, war came about, and we had to be on our own, and we had to be self-sufficient. And we could only produce 23% of what we consume. And we'd have lost most of the capability to produce the machine tools and the foundry equipment and the plastic equipment and everything else to increase the factories to make the things that we no longer make. It'll be a horrible situation. So I believe that 23% self-sufficiency is absolutely unacceptable. So the objective is to balance the 700 billion non-petroleum goods trade deficit, and that would increase manufacturing in the U.S. about 40%. And I would see that as being a mix of maybe 25% less imports and 15% more exports. Now, in the current trade negotiations, everybody talks about exporting more, exporting more, exporting more, because it sounds a little less invasive maybe than I'm not going to take your imports. But to me, it's not practical. So we'd suggest the mix that I show there. There would be about 5 million manufacturing jobs, 40% of our current 12 million manufacturing employment, 5 million jobs at current U.S. levels of productivity. It would cut the U.S. budget deficit, something nobody has spent too much time on lately, but the obviously a long-term, absolutely important thing for the country. And because when you bring back the manufacturing jobs, you have more people making money, more companies making money, more taxes being paid, less safety net expenditures, no need for stimulus programs, et cetera, et cetera. The budget deficit falls dramatically. It provides material for defense. The Defense Department frequently talks about we no longer can get this and that made in the United States that we need for the military. It would restore the middle class. Much of the hollowing out of income has been due to the decline in manufacturing. And it isn't just the workers, it's the owners. So there's been a decline of tens of thousands of small to medium-sized U.S. manufacturing companies. What Germany takes so much pride in their Mittelstand that we used to have pretty good, but we lost an awful lot of it because our companies started to buy those components from offshore instead of having our smaller companies make them here. So we would restore the workers, but we'd also restore the small business owners, which are essential for many of our communities. How many of you are familiar with the skilled workforce shortage? Right, everybody knows about that. And the one reason we have that is that the students and the guidance counselors say, why would you want Susan to become a welder when manufacturing is all going offshore? And why should she go through an apprenticeship when there aren't going to be any jobs 4 years from now when she finishes the apprenticeship? So by bringing work back and letting everybody seeing it's coming back, it'll be a lot easier to recruit the smart, aggressive kids that we need for the future. It will increase domestic demand because of the multiplier effect, increase R&D. Most of the R&D in the country is done by manufacturers. If the manufacturing isn't done here, the R&D is likely to be done somewhere else. It will reduce global pollution. When something's made in China instead of the U.S., the Chinese electricity is much dirtier than ours because they use much more coal. The factories are, on average, more polluting, and then you have to ship the stuff all the way here. I did a study that showed when you bring aluminum die casting back, you cut the carbon footprint in half by bringing it back here instead of there. To get our capacity up by about 40%, you'd have to increase capital investment by about 20%, or ramp up 20%, and then whatever else would have happened anyway. So you'd be dramatically, AMT members would be selling a lot more machine tools, and productivity would be rising dramatically. And finally, you can have both productivity and growth in manufacturing employment. Everybody worries about we're going to have so much productivity and so many robots that employment is going to go like this. But when you see that you can increase manufacturing by 40%, you can dramatically increase productivity and increase manufacturing employment at the same time. So what we see is a virtuous cycle where as reshoring happens, reshoring in FDI, capacity utilization goes up. The factories are operating at, they get past that 80% threshold, and then they start to invest, and they invest in the newest, and they can afford to invest in the newest and best equipment. Their productivity goes up, they become more competitive, and then more reshoring is possible. So to give you a feeling for the current situation, this is AMT data on investment in consumption of machine tools, China and the U.S. So the red is China, the blue is the U.S. So it used to be, back here, we were 3-4 times what they were doing. Here's the last intersection around 2001, and now they're around 30 billion, and we're somewhere around $9 or $10 billion a year. So China is investing about 3 times as much in machine tools, which is how you, at least in machining, increase your productivity, buying the newest and the best CNC robots, etc. And And we claim that our manufacturing, the value of our manufacturing is about equal to the value of China's, but they're investing 3 times as much as we are. So in the long run, that's not a pretty situation. And why are we investing less? Why are they investing more? Because they're making so much more of the stuff that we used to make. So they've taken that, that's allowed them to grow, and we've allowed our companies to decline, and they're not busy, and they're not as profitable as they would have been, and therefore they haven't invested. We need to turn that around. So some myths that you run into all the time. Few jobs can be brought back. If you read the articles about this, the people pontificating on trade, they'll say few jobs can be brought back. And we say in 2017, the number of jobs announced for reshoring and FDI was 171,000. A major contribution to the U.S. economy. How many of you have heard something like the robots are going to take all of our jobs, tax the robots? So, pretty common, populist kind of thing to say. Even some of the top companies have said that. And our view is that we will lose more jobs to Chinese automation if we do not automate than we will lose to U.S. automation if we do automate. So if you have a choice, if they're going to automate, we have to automate. Otherwise, we continue to lose jobs to offshore. There's a professor at Ball State University who has repeatedly been quoted that somewhere between 4 and 13% of the 6 million manufacturing job loss was due to offshoring, and the rest, so the vast majority, was due to productivity. And every other credible analyst on the subject, David Altor at MIT, ITIF, Susan at Upjohn, everybody else concludes that at least 60% of the loss was due to offshoring, and that productivity has been historically slow the last 10 or so years. And why is this important to understand? If you believe that almost no jobs have been lost to offshoring, then there's no purpose in reshoring because you have nothing to bring back. So it's really essential to understand that we've lost about 5 million jobs to offshoring, and therefore at current levels of U.S. productivity, and therefore we have the potential to bring millions of jobs back. Also, I hear, how many of you have heard, manufacturing employment will inevitably decline like agriculture. You see in the charts, agriculture is down to like 3% of total employment from 90 to 100. So the belief is that it's going to, manufacturing do the same. Very popular claim, but I say the big difference is that agriculture is high volume, low mix, whereas manufacturing is increasingly low volume, high mix, customizing the product. And as you do that, it's harder to automate to the extent that agriculture has done. So I see the reality as being a tilted playing field, where we're the guys on the bottom trying to fight our way up, and it's a very difficult condition, and it's mainly driven by price. Our prices expressed in a common currency, if you put theirs in dollars and our in dollars, we're just not price competitive. And here's the results of a survey that Plant Moran, which is one of the largest tax consulting and accounting firms, did in conjunction with the reshoring initiative. And they asked companies, how much do you offshore? How much do you buy from offshore? And why do you buy it? And so you can see price turned out to be 53% of the reason. And then the next 3 items there, they total about 20%. It's not available in the U.S. The product can't be purchased. Why not? Because those companies that made it went out of business because they couldn't compete on price with the offshore sources. The customer or the corporation mandate is that we buy it from the other country. Why? Because the price is lower offshore. So somewhere between 50 and at least 70% of the companies are driven by price in making their decision of where to get the product. Now this chart takes that same survey results and shows you for each, it compares the ex-works price in the other country to the ex-works price in China. And so, for example, if you come over here to the left-hand bar, about 33% of the items that are import, or the value of the items that are import, have an ex-works price less than 50% of the U.S. price. So devastatingly low. Very hard to convince someone to pay twice as much. And then for each of the subsequent sections, 51 to 66, it shows how much. And if you summarize that, there's about 67% missing in the left-hand column. So these others represent 67%, and they're spread out over 50 percentage points. So on the average, For every 1 percentage point that the U.S. becomes more price competitive relative to the imports, we pick up about 1.3% of the imports. Right? So you could say the slope of this is something like 1.3 to 1. So every 1%, we get more price competitive. We bring back about 1.3% of all the imports. So some things that drive the U.S. price to not be competitive. We have an insufficient quantity and level of training of our skilled workforce, especially compared to the other developed countries, compared to Germany, Switzerland, Austria, Japan, almost every other developed country does a much better job of training people than we do. They recruit better and they train them better. Our currency is driven much higher than it would traditionally be. Traditionally, a currency would rise if you had a trade surplus in goods. It would drop if you had a trade deficit. But now the currency is driven by the flow of cash and financial deposits into the United States because we're the reserve currency and the safe haven, and that drives the value of the U.S. currency up much higher than goods traditionally would have, and therefore we're not competitive. It's a great place to be a bank. It's not a good place to be a factory. The currency being high makes our wage rates higher than they would otherwise be if you express them in the same currency as the other country, and similarly for other costs. Our corporate tax rates were way out of line with the rest of the world. They're now close to where they should be. With the tax rate so high, the return on investment of investing here was not as good as it was elsewhere. Therefore, factories were placed elsewhere, so our productivity didn't go up. We don't have a value-added tax of VAT. Everybody know how that works? Yeah, so basically, VAT works. The countries that have them, when their companies export, they get a credit for the value, roughly the value of the export, say 15%, and anything that's imported gets taxed the 15%. And so our companies, when we export, get hit with a 15% tax going into almost every other country, whereas their products coming here, they get a credit of 15%, and then we don't tax them for the 15%. So automatically a 15 or a 30% disadvantage. Our duties are half to a third of what the average duty is of the countries with which we trade. Regulations have been too high, they're getting better. We have supply chain gaps. Whole sections of the economy went out of business because they couldn't compete. So, for example, microprocessors for small consumer electronics aren't made here, tiny ones, and therefore Apple is unlikely to make the cell phone here because they can't get the products here that they need to produce it. Other countries have much more subsidies. IP theft we heard a lot about. But a whole range of these things make us unpriced competitive. So a survey was done back about 9 years ago, and it turned out that about 60%, so 60% of the companies made their sourcing decisions based on wage, something called wage arbitrage, go where the wages are cheapest, PPV, purchase price variance, buy it where the export price is lowest, landed cost, which would be that price plus maybe duty and freight, maybe packaging. But we say they should be looking at total cost of ownership, which would add another 15, 20% to that cost, and would add in the carrying cost of inventory, the travel cost, the quality differential, the intellectual property risk, the impact of innovation when you bring manufacturing and engineering back together, the risk of stocking out when you have a 3-month lead time instead of a 2-week lead time, a whole series of things like this. Now, the same applies to back office processing, so office things, call centers, IT. It's a very simplistic approach that companies have used. The good news is that some of that's changing. This chart shows index unit labor costs, so the cost of labor to produce a thing. And whatever it was in each of the countries that's shown here back in 2000, they called it 100. And then each year going forward, increased it by the average percentage change in the wage rate, the change in the currency relative to the dollar, because it's all expressed in dollars, and by productivity. U.S. stays about constant because we've had roughly 2% wage increases, something like 2% productivity. And the other countries bounce around with currency, whereas the one coming up here at the top is China. And so they are 5 times what they were in terms of unit labor cost 18 years ago. And that's because they had the one-child policy, so their supply of labor is doing this, the demand for labor is doing this as they grew so fast, so the price of labor has been going up at 10 or 15% per year. And that's made them much less competitive than they were in the past. This is the time when companies are trying to decide, should we pull the work out of China? If so, do we move it to Vietnam, Cambodia, India, Africa, somewhere, Mexico? Or should we bring it back to the United States? And we would say that in many cases, instead of going to Vietnam and then to India and then to Africa, why not just come back to mother here and save all those transitions that you would otherwise have? So back around 2000, 2003, that's the column over here, you can see we were offshore, or losing to offshore 240,000 manufacturing jobs a year, just a huge amount of jobs, just bleeding. And bring back maybe 10, 15,000. And so net losing about 220,000. And by 2016, the rate of loss to offshore was only about 50,000, and the rate of gain coming back maybe 77,000. So we'd gone from a net loss of, say, over 200,000 per year to a net gain of, say, 27,000 a year. So a very nice start, but only a start. That was 2016. And this shows in orange, left out of blue for shoring, what's happening from 2017 came out to 171,000 jobs coming back announced, and that's up 50% from 2016, apparently largely in anticipation of tax reductions, regulatory reform, et cetera, and it's up 2,800% from 2010. So just a huge trend in the jobs coming back to the United States. So my group, the Reshoring Initiative, our mission is to accelerate that trend, because if not careful, it's going to do this, and it's going to plateau, and then it's going to come down again. So our job is to help companies bring some jobs back today, and also to take the tilt out of that playing field so that more jobs can go back tomorrow. We have an online library of over 5,000 articles about reshoring and FDI that any of you can go online and use. I think you'll find it very helpful. All kinds of statistics from that. We have a place where you can report cases of reshoring, and everybody who comes in and reports a real case of reshoring gets a free manufactured this cool t-shirt, okay, made out of cotton and made in the United States. Okay, so this should be a desired item for you. And I have 5 or 6 of those here in various sizes. So whoever comes up to see me afterward and has thoughts on cooperation and collaboration will get a t-shirt that you should be proud to wear. You know? I talked about the motivation for skilled manufacturing careers. Our key offering is the total cost of ownership estimator. I mentioned this calculation of all the costs that should be considered. And companies use it for sourcing. Where should I buy the castings? Where should I buy the parts? Where should I put my factory? But suppliers of parts and equipment use it for selling, use it to convince the other company to buy from them here rather than offshore. So you see that pretty quickly. Here's in this case, the Chinese exports price was 70, the U.S. exports price was 100. And so the easy decision by the purchasing person is, okay, get up in China, I save 30%. It's easy. But if they did total cost of ownership, they saw that China was 98, the U.S. was 108. And projecting those going forward based on the assumptions about the current continued currency and wage changes, within a couple of years, the U.S. total cost was going to be lower than for China. And so hopefully the company, having done this analysis, would say, wow, we shouldn't send any more abroad, because if we do, it's going to have to come back soon anyway, move the tooling, move everything else. And the stuff that's abroad, we should be starting to hire and train and invest and find suppliers and start to plan to bring that work back to the U.S. So let's see the power of this. I took the cases of China versus the U.S., and this is a histogram. It turns out to be a fairly normal distribution that shows the Chinese export price is a percentage of the U.S. This is 0, 50%, 100%. And so you see the mode, central tendency for the normal distribution is around 70, 72, something like that. So on the average, the Chinese price is about 70% of the U.S. So in this, the blue graph is that same statistic from Chinese export price, and the reddish line is total cost of ownership. So you can see how it shifts about 15 percentage points to the right, and all of a sudden, instead of having just a little bit that's above 100%. There's a substantial portion, we'd say about 25% of what is imported uh, has a lower U.S. total cost than an offshore total cost, and therefore, if the companies would do the math, 25% of what's offshore would come back, which would be a major solution to the problem. So there's been some supportive academic research. We have some good friends at Ohio State University, Professor John Gray, and he and his team did in-depth research at 4 small to medium-sized manufacturers, and they discovered that that when the companies went offshore, the people who made the decision had limited offshoring experience, and they focused only on the lowest per piece cost, price. But when they decided to bring the work back, they had learned from these experiences, and they considered all kinds of costs and risks other than those that were considered when they worked first one offshore. So what they concluded from this very in-depth analysis of 4 companies is entirely consistent with our conclusion from looking at thousands of companies more superficially. So I was pleased to see the results of John's work, and it's been published. So, in the United States, especially under President Obama, there was a big effort to double exports. It didn't succeed. It made some progress, but did not succeed. And we think it's good to export more, but it's easier to import less. And to let you understand that, if you take a product that's made in the U.S. and sold here for 100, and one that's made in China and sold in China for 70, and why do I pick 70? Because Chinese export price is 70% of U.S. export price. And if you add 15% roughly for the hidden cost of total cost, the one that's sold in China for 70 can be sold here for 80, and the one we're selling here for 100, we better sell for 115 over there, and that's not even including the value-added tax. So now in the U.S., when we're competing in the U.S. price is about 25% above the Chinese price, whereas if we try and sell in China, we're 64% above the Chinese price. So would you rather be 25% higher, 64%? It's just intuitively obvious that it's a lot easier to compete here on our own market, on our own playing field, than it is to try and do it offshore. So, and nevertheless, the U.S., especially the Commerce Department, spends about 60 times as much encouraging exporting as it does encouraging reshoring or reduction of imports. So we think that's an excellent place to put some focus. There's another tool that we work with, and this is provided by a professor, Treville, from the University of Lausanne in Switzerland. She's an American, but she works over there. And this looks at products that best looks at their volatility of demand, and what you can use her calculator online, and it tells you how much how much less an imported product has to be based on how long its delivery is relative to something that's instantaneously delivered. And she comes up typically with 25%, 30%, and this number is more or less additive to the number that we come up with in our calculation. So you put the two together, and it's overwhelming in many cases to bring the work back. Oh, she also has another analysis, another methodology that says it makes sense. It clearly makes sense to produce your low volume, high mix products that require instant delivery here. But since you set up the factory and train the people to do that, when there's valleys in that production, you can make the high volume, low mix things that you think you can't afford to make here. But because you've made the other products absorb that overhead, it makes sense to make those products here also. And she's had very good success helping companies do that, make that decision. So here's just a mix of reshorers, companies that have reshored. Tends to be big companies at the top, smaller companies at the bottom. A couple of them are contract manufacturers. This is an injection molding company and a metal forming company, Peace, and they're contract manufacturers, and they work really hard to help companies decide to bring their work back and let them make it for them here. One of my favorite cases, Mori Corp, is an EMS company who make printed circuit boards or populate printed circuit boards outside Chicago. When they brought back a component of housing, they cut their inventory by 94%. And for companies cutting inventory by 90%, that's overwhelming. You could afford to build a factory if you could do that. And then they came to me about a year ago, and the VP of sales, Tony, said, Harry, we're about to lose one of our biggest U.S. customers to a Chinese competitor over the subject of price. So Tony and I did the TCO calculation, used our online system. He took it into the customer, and I got a quote from him crediting doing that analysis as the key to saving a $60 million order by helping the customer see all the costs instead of just the price. So I was delighted to have that. Should have asked for commission, probably, didn't. So we have data. I'm going to go through this very quickly. So we have data on what industries are coming back. Interesting, apparel and textiles is doing amazingly well, something we lost, but we lost so much of it that there's big possibilities to bring it back. If you look at the mix of technology level of products, there's a tendency towards high to medium high, but there's still a fair amount of low to medium low in here. You can see the summaries down here. So it's tending towards high to medium high, but it's rather well distributed. Here's the reasons, the things that went wrong offshore, things like quality, delivery, intellectual property risk, etc. Here are the things that went right here when they came back. And I highlighted in red some of the things that the government could do something about. The government incentives obviously helps. I have people call me all the time, Harry, can you get me $1 million or $2 million so I can bring my work back? And no, I can't get it for you. A skilled workforce availability and training. The U.S., at the federal level, the state, the local level, does a horrible job of basic education, but also specifically of training the skilled workforce. Ecosystem, so supply chain synergies. We have a system to identify gaps in the ecosystem that companies can use to, or states could use to go to foreign companies to do FDI and fill those gaps. And now having those microprocessors available so Apple can decide to assemble here. Infrastructure. The countries from which the workers come back. In reshoring, it's primarily from China, because that's where most of it went. In FDI, it's primarily from Germany and Japan, especially with the big auto companies coming over here with thousands and thousands of jobs. In terms of states that the work went to, it tends to be in the right-to-work states in the Southeast and Texas, but Michigan has done amazingly well, I think built on its strong industrial base. Ohio has done well. Indiana and New York has done rather well. So this gives you some feeling for where the work is coming back to. So when you, we'd say that the decline has paused and has proven the recovery is possible. This is an interesting chart. Each of the marks, each of the dots, is manufacturing employment at the end of a calendar year. And this goes from 1997 to 2017. And we took the blue ones from before China joined the WTO till just before the Great Recession, did a regression line through that. So as of 2006 or 2007, if you were going to project what the manufacturing employment would be in 2017, you probably would have said less than 10 million. And instead, it's about 12.5. Now, this doesn't look like, it's not like doing this, but it's a lot better than doing that. And to us, it's clear that the reason that the slope has changed so much, the reason that's moderately up instead of strongly down, is that we're not losing anywhere near as much to offshoring, and we're bringing back dramatically more jobs than we had been before. And there's other reasons. Productivity isn't as great, and et cetera. But we believe these are major causes for that trend. So I mentioned this before, where so you can see that difference. And the key thing is to get not just a few industries to be competitive, but to get most industries to be competitive. So we don't believe significantly in selecting industries, selecting winners that most of the free market people are against. But we believe in a policy tide that uniformly lifts all industries and gives all industries a chance to compete. That you shouldn't say, I've given up on apparel, I've given up on steel, but you shouldn't preferentially help those industries, but you should make the tide come up and give everybody a chance, and then the ones that can compete and will succeed. So we've put together what we call a competitiveness toolkit from which the government can select action. So I'll go through it briefly. The left column is the factor with the action. So skilled workforce to us is always overwhelmingly, the most important thing to work on. And the motto would be Germany and Switzerland. And we believe we can pick up probably a 5% price advantage by having an apprentice program and skilled workforce, the equivalent of those countries. A lower corporate tax rate, we're significantly there, coming down to 21%. A 15% VAT, almost all the rest of the world has it. We should have it. The dollar down about 20%, we would do. Absolutely essential, very important anyway. Lower regulations. Healthcare costs, we're paying, 17 or something percent of our GDP for healthcare. Germany pays 10, 12%. That means the cost of our labor, the cost of our taxes, everything is higher because we have those healthcare costs. If you can get our costs down to Germany's, which are just as good as our cost, you take a lot of the cost out of labor, take cost out of labor. Even at the same standard of living, our costs come down. Everybody using total cost and that cost differential frontier that I showed you, we think is worth about 10%. Make duty rates equal on the U.S. and abroad, maybe worth 3%, whether we go up or they come down. Innovation, automation, other people could add other things to the list. The key thing is that if you add all these up, you get about 51%. And this shows how long we think it would take to implement it. Skilled workforce is almost surely the hardest, the longest, because there's so much societal attitude that has to be changed. My estimate of ease of passage in the House and the Senate, where 8 is easy, 10 is highest, easy, and then severity of secondary impacts like inflation, World Trade Organization, things like that. So just to show we've taken somewhat of a holistic view of this thing, okay? And then this shows what you get for those reductions. So in theory, we have 51% possible reduction in the U.S. price. We know we're not going to get all that. But depending on how much you'd like to reduce the trade deficit, this is how many million manufacturing jobs you would get back. This is, if companies continue to buy on the basis of price, how much we'd have to reduce our price relative to the offshore price. If we switch them all over to TCO, this is how much we'd have to reduce our price relative to offshore, and my estimate of how long it would take to do it. So we've got a package here that the government can take and decide what can we pass, how many jobs we want. We would say don't do them all today, because if you implemented all of it now and we tried to increase employment by 5 million in 2019, it wouldn't happen, and the system would explode. Then our deliveries would collapse, and it would be crazy. So the government needs to make the commitment to get the tide up over the next 5, 10 years, absolute rigid commitment, and then make a good solid effort on it at the beginning, so that the guidance counselors and everybody know to train the kids into manufacturing, and the companies know to start investing because they know it's going to be a safe place to be a factory. So one of the keys to this is the market access charge. Is John here? Okay, good, John. Thank you. So John Hansen, who's an international economist and is associated with CPA, right? He's come up with a market access charge, which would charge foreign financial investors a market access fee when the dollar's overvalued and there are trade deficits, and they're at 0.25% or something on that. It depends on how big the deficit is, et cetera. And it would rise and fall as the trade deficit rises or falls. And so you could achieve a permanent trade balance, because what this would do, remember I mentioned how the dollar's too high because of all the financial inflows. I don't mind inflows to buy factories when the money just comes here and sits here and they bought dollars. Spending bonds, spending euro, what have you. That's driving our dollar up. We can't compete in factories. So John's charge would force the currency back down to the point where the factories are once again competitive. So John, I thank you for that. It's a good plan. Yeah. Once again, so supportive of that, the concepts that I gave you there. I'll go back to that Plant Moran study, and this shows what the respondents said. So 17%. They said that getting the currency down by 20% would bring back 17% of the work that was offshore. Okay. They said using total cost would bring back 7%. Corporate tax rate of 20% would be worth 7%. Having a value-added tax 6%. Having skills like Germany 4%. Regulatory burden down 50% 4%, healthcare costs 1%, government research dollars up 50% 1%, So I'm not saying that their numbers are perfect, but they're more or less consistent with our numbers, and it shows that the companies at least have some idea of what would be necessary to get things together. So our recommended actions are specifically for commerce to balance the duty rates. It's absolutely insane. But back when we were the dominant country in the world, it made some sense for us to have low duties to help the other countries. We need to help now. We can't afford to be sugar daddy anymore. Emphasize reshoring as much as exports. Instead of a 60-1 imbalance, you get going on reshoring. You get the dollar down by 20%. The Labor Department apprenticeships and stronger arguments for skilled careers. I'll show you something about that. The Education Department is great at developing a $1.3 or $1.4 trillion student loan debt. I'd like to see apprenticeship loans to make it more competitive for the company and the apprentice to be an apprentice for the 4 years, and then maybe let the company pay off the loan if the worker stays on for 4 or 5 years afterward. Congress, everybody knows about the R&D tax credit, but you can use that to subsidize 4 engineers to work here for 2 years to develop a product, and then have 300 people manufacturing the product in China. So I would insist that for the R&D tax credit to be taken, you had to manufacture the product in the U.S. for 3 years or 5 years or something like that, and then you get the tax credit. Otherwise, you don't get it. Everybody know what EB-5 is? All right. That's where foreign individuals can get U.S., I think, residency if they invest something like $500,000 here. But almost all of it goes into apartment houses and maybe restaurants and things like that. Almost none of it goes into manufacturing. And do we need more apartment houses? Do we need more? No, we don't really need more. But do we need more factories? Do we need foreign companies to do foreign direct investment here to fill those gaps that I described? So I would make the EB-5 requirements preferential for manufacturing. Make a lower threshold for manufacturing, a higher threshold for these, what I would call non-essential industries. We need a value-added tax. And if I were the president of the Congress, if I talked to them, I'd ask them just to call on the companies to do the math. Not insist that they bring the work back, but insist that they do the math and see that, and because they'll see when they do the math that a significant portion of the work will come back. So we see the same kind of virtuous cycle as you pick up the skilled workforce. About 6 years ago, I was in the Secretary of Labor's office at her conference room. They called me down to tell them how to get the skilled workforce ready for reshoring. And I stood up and said, well, first we have to get the Labor Department to stop being part of the problem and become part of the solution. Unfortunately, they didn't kick me out. Instead, they said, what do you have? And I pulled up their BLS website, Bureau of Labor Statistics. And they said, this says education pays and shows income going up with number of degrees. And I said, this is the kind of data that convinces the reporters, the columnists, the economists. Everybody's got to go to university because you make 50% more than you do with a high school degree. I said, why doesn't it say education and training pay? Why doesn't it have the average income of people who passed an apprenticeship? So that people can see that that's at least as good a solution on average as a bachelor's degree, especially a liberal arts bachelor's degree. And instantly they folded. They said, you're absolutely right. Then they changed the website about halfway to what I wanted them to do. And it spread, got a lot of attention. But there's still all kinds of websites at labor and education that say everybody's got to get a university degree. And I've offered to them to go through the website and tell them everything they should change. And so far, they have not taken me up on the offer, but the offer is still open. So we would say that in your community, in your industry, get rid of the terms trades and vocations, call them professionals, like the Swiss and the Germans do. In your community, get all the companies to report their cases of reshoring, and get the media to pick those up every month, every quarter, all the cases of reshoring in our community, so that the public knows what's happening. We have a program that states, associations, and others, so those who are interns from congressmen's offices, et cetera, but we have a program called the Import Substitution Program that you could pass back to your state economic developers, any associations here, that you could also try it for your association. And what we can do is provide data on importers of the products a state or a company wants to produce domestically. So we can tell you who the consignee company is, their address, the product they bring in, tons per year of product, who the offshore supplier is, so that your people can go to those companies and train the companies on total cost of ownership and help the companies decide that it makes sense to produce the work here or source it here rather than continuing to import it. We can also identify gaps in the U.S. supply chain, like we talked about before. What are the gaps? Who are the foreign suppliers that are supplying, filling those, that are supplying and shipping into those gaps? So that you, at the state level, can go to those companies and say, okay, you're getting 10% of that because you're competing with 10 other Chinese. How about you put a factory here in Indiana, right in the center of the market for that? Maybe you'll get 30% of this. So why don't you do a little foreign direct investment here, and all of us will be better off. You're going to be a winner. We also have a program for back office processing. So if anybody's interested in back office processing, we can work with companies to bring that back also. So we're a nonprofit with we have 27 sponsors. AMT was our lead sponsors. Again, I thank Chris and AMT for that. And then a series of other companies and trade associations that allow us to stay in business. And when things were starting, this is how we thought of ourselves. You know, at least I thought of myself back when I had hair, and as a little Dutch boy holding the dike together. But now that it's going a lot better, I probably need to come up with a less defensive picture or something like that. So a couple of things that I didn't mention that I wanted, like the kind of myths that I see out there. I pulled this out of the Chicago Tribune about 2 weeks ago. An article by George Trump. In my respect, not Paul quite a bit, but it's Trump's trade war would avenge only mythical casualties. Mythical casualties. When there's 5 million jobs that were lost to offshoring, and tens of thousands of companies, manufacturing companies, were closed because of offshoring. But to refer to that as mythical casualties is insulting to those people who lost their jobs and the social unrest and families splitting up because people lost their jobs. So George is a smart guy, and then you know George. If you'd ask him to get in touch with me, I'd be glad to train him a little bit. So I'm open for general questions. I think but I think I mentioned the case that we took on analyzing the 2-pound aluminum digestion, which was being offshore, and compared the production in the U.S. to production in China, and looked at especially at the environmental pollution from the electricity production because the coal, China's coal is so much more coal intensive, very dirty coal, and then the factories were a little more polluting, and then shipping it up later on the world competitors. So it's an excellent argument. And unfortunately, most of the companies, most brands, they're very good at measuring the pollution of their own factory, pretty good at measuring that of their U.S. supplier, and poor at measuring that of their offshore suppliers. So there's probably in their apparent interest to have it done offshore where they can't see it. Whereas, so what we provide with this tool, which is in development, is a method for estimating the impact of that offshore supplier, and so that we see the value of bringing the product back to the U.S. Quickly, question. Yeah.
Hi, thank you. Jerry Zapian, Department of Commerce, International Trade Administration, Office of Manufacturing. Thank you very much for your wonderful library. I've used it recently to do a little internal study on U.S. medical device manufacturers who have reshored and who are now exporting. So we really appreciate that. It's kind of the double whammy there. Given that, of course, we play no favorites in this, and a rising tide lifts all boats. But the study that I was doing, the research that I was doing, was mainly SMEs and high-tech companies. If Do you think, is there any low-hanging fruit? Is there a particular profile of companies that might be benefiting, or an industry that might benefit first from reshoring? Big companies, small companies, high tech? We hear a lot about steel and aluminum these days. But yeah, if there's anything to say about that, I don't even know if that's a fair question.
That's a good question.
Okay.
Before I did the reshoring, I had a SWOT analysis, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, and identified the characteristics of companies that were most competitive here. High mix, low volume. Freight is an important characteristic. The quick delivery is essential. Design change is frequent, and it's more difficult to get the prototype done on the new product offshore than to do here. The intellectual property. I got that. So if you contact me, I'll send you a study that would outline the characteristics that would identify industries, okay, or products within industries. And then secondly, a good estimate would be the ones that are coming back are the ones most likely to come back. So if you pick the ones where there's been a fair amount that's come back, but where there's still a lot offshore, that would make sense. And I would say that the most obvious ones went offshore first, the apparel, this company. And therefore, if you looked at the ones that went offshore, say, 5 to 10 years ago, they'd be logical to bring back. And another thought process another characteristic would be, we would say the easiest, like if the company says, what should I do? Tell me here, what should I do? Okay, I say, first, nothing more goes offshore without doing the math. Because once it's offshore, it's hard to bring back. Second would be anything that is outsourced offshore. In other words, being made by a different company, not by your factory offshore, but some foundry or machine company. Why it's easier to cancel that order or terminate that order at the end of it and find somebody here to make it. No investment for you, no penalties over there, no layoffs over there, no China getting mad at you, kind of thing. Right? So second would be what's outsourced offshore. Third, you've got a factory of your own offshore, and let's say it's shipping half of the product back to the U.S., half into Asia, and we'd say repurpose it to be 95% for Asia, and start do your initial extra investments here, and so we could help you identify companies that have their own factories offshore and are bringing in, and we could and they would be we can identify those that might be good candidates for that. The toughest thing is a company to tell them to shut down their $100 million factory offshore and build a $150 million here, especially if it's the same company president has to admit he made a mistake 5 years ago. That's tough. So that's like a triage kind of things to do.
Right. Kind of a long equation. Thank you. And if you give me a shirt, I'll try to get it to the secretary for you.
Okay. Actually, somebody else in your department, Emiliano, came to me for all kinds of data on reshoring and FDI. Yeah, so somebody in there in the Commerce Department.
Well, some of our TASs and ASs may be
Yeah.
I'm Yubin Guo from Advanced Manufacturing Program Office. Very good talk. Thank you very much. And even follow your recommendations, you currency, apprenticeship, all these things, you can bring down the U.S. product price. But another factor we need to consider is the quality. So the Chinese product quality, even though the price is down, but they improve the quality. In the end, our manufacturing competitiveness not necessarily strong. So I know this complex issue is not only economic issue, but also the other factors.
Okay, you keep it. So I think your comment was that Chinese quality is going up, and therefore that makes China relatively more competitive. Is that fair?
Yes.
Okay. And I guess there's two things. First, I think you're right, it has gone up, although I still run into cases where companies say when they made the prototypes in the first run for us, they put the A-team on it. Now they're getting into regular production, and they got the B or the C team on it, and the quality went down. I hear cases like that. True. Chinese products are still the represent, I think, the majority of product recalls at the consumer products in the United States. And I have not taken the time to compare that to what percentage of the products there are. It might be disproportionate. So we should do that study. But the U.S. is also doing a good job on its quality. If you compare our cars, for example, we've learned a lot from Japan, we've learned a lot from Germany, and the quality of the U.S. product has come up substantially. So I think quality is a good area for competition. But each company should look at the product and make its own evaluation. So I think it's a very important consideration.
China will always be very competitive for apparel because the sewers learn how to sew at the age of 5, and we just don't do that in the U.S.
Yeah, yeah. Lynn was saying that we just don't have the skilled workforce for sewing. But fortunately, there were some very good technologies, some automation being developed to handle the material and automate the production. So it's possible that we'll work around that issue. But no question, there's a shortage of sewers and cutters, et cetera. Yeah?
Shirish Parikh, I started manufacturing business, Hydraulics Global, which is one of the largest hydraulics manufacturer in the country, and recently launched Advanced Manufacturing Fund, as we were talking earlier, and was also chair of Skills Commission for President Obama on his Manufacturing Council. Everything you said it completely resonates with what I believe and what I have been seeing. So it's good to see that thinking coming back. And the skills issue, the TCO issue you talk about. A month ago, I was in Silicon Valley, and we were in a roundtable with Jabil, which is one of the largest, contract manufacturers. When you talk to the chief operating officer, they still continue to believe that there is no way. Their belief is, if it made sense to do it in US, we would have done it already. It does not make sense. How would you answer if he was in this room? I just can't, I relate to everything you are saying, but I can't seem to understand their views.
Yeah, I would, if they called me in, I would say, it's tougher because we're a contract manufacturer, not a brand. Normally I deal with brands. But let's say we're a brand. I'd say I don't say pick 3 random products. I say pick products where you're having issues of quality, delivery, intellectual property, et cetera, too much inventory, and let's do the math. Let's work out the total cost. Let's see what what it's costing you to have that lower price. And they'll say we got to have a lower price because it's saving us 20%. I say maybe it's costing you 30% in terms of all those other factors. So I would ask them to do that analysis, and I'd start with the parts where they were having problems because they're more likely to champion the study. And would it succeed? Wouldn't it succeed? Small electronics is tough because you see those pictures of people in the Apple with the Foxconn factories doing it. But Americans don't want to do that. They'd rather not work than do that. But as that becomes automated, and as the younger Chinese worker are in shorter supply and they're unwilling to do that because they all want to become philosophers and sociologists and economists, then it's going to be harder for China to have the people to do the sewing, to do that electronic assembly, and then it's going to be whoever automates more effectively. And so I guess I say the challenge is automate it enough here so that you can do it here. John.
Thank you, Harry. First off, I'd like to say I'm making a 1,000-mile round trip to hear this presentation, and it's worth every mile. Excellent presentation. I strongly support every one of the initiatives, every one of the policy approaches that you talk about. They're all essential, and looking forward to seeing results of it. Second, since I have developed this market access charge, I'd like to say just a brief word. It's not just an idea now. We have legislation. It's been vetted by the Senate Legislative Council. We recently had a group of us here, about 80. We visited 130 congressional offices with the legislation, got very positive responses. We have a number of senators and congresspeople who are actively considering and some on the verge of sponsoring the legislation. I have one copy of it here, but if you speak to me after the meeting, I would be glad to take your name, your card, send you the information. This is something that is very real. And if we can, as Harry was saying, level the playing field, get rid of this 25% balance against the United States. Our current overvalued dollar acts as a 25% tax on every product produced in the United States. Even if it's not exported, the U.S. manufacturer has to meet the China price. It has to cut its price so it can meet the China price. The 25% overvaluation means that it's extremely hard to export with a 25% penalty. You add to that the 15% penalty of the VAT, you're in real trouble. I fully agree with Harry that the best shot is going to be to increase imports. Increasing exports is going to be more difficult. And finally, in response to your question, just I again agree with everything. I tend to agree with what Harry says, just in general. But the products that are most labor intensive and that have the highest U.S. content are most likely to become competitive fastest if you fix the U.S. dollar. Harry and I have had some very interesting exchanges in modeling and have pretty well determined that the exchange rate is important, but it has the most importance on inputs, labor and materials that are U.S. sourced and therefore directly impacted by the dollar. Again, Harry, congratulations. And as I say, I'd be glad to take names and send you further information.
Maybe a little on that, since currency is so important. Is it clear that we could do the market access charge and not have WTO or other international problems?
Thank you for asking that. It's very interesting. We have studied IMF, WTO, OECD, the U.S. BIT, the bilateral investment treaties, the free trade agreements, and as nearly as we can tell, the market access charge is legal by all of these, very explicitly in the case of the IMF. Would not have been the case 10 years ago, but in 2012, they issued an institutional view on capital flow management tools, and the market access charge is a tool to manage capital inflows, keep them consistent with what we need, not with the speculation that the foreigners want to dump into our markets. The reason that it tends to escape on all fronts is that this is a tax on money, not a tax on goods. And the focus for decades, as a matter of fact, for centuries, has always been taxing goods and therefore the restrictions on it. But to answer your question directly, Harry, we see no barrier, a legal barrier, from any of these organizations on the MAC.
Good. Thank you, John. Yeah. So I think maybe just to add a little bit to that, where most of the articles or about other countries manipulating their currency. And unquestionably China did, unquestionably Japan does. Germany, in effect, does by staying part of the euro. But the overwhelming problem isn't so much that individual countries' currencies are too low, is that the U.S. dollar is consistently too high against all other countries. And that's where John's approach would get us down substantially relative to all currencies and do this boat floating or industry floating that I described. So thank you, John. Yeah.
Thank you.
Hey, Eli Levine with the Department of Energy. I guess we'll compete to see which cabinet secretary can style the shirt first. Following a little bit on her question from before, have you looked, and prefacing it, great presentation, really learned a lot. This was great. Have you looked at all at the low cost of energy or energy saving techniques and technologies as a driver for manufacturing competitiveness here in the U.S.?
Well, it's clear that we have this big advantage with shale gas. Okay, and the low cost of shale gas and oil that's flown from fracking has made the U.S. the site for announcements of $250 to $300 billion worth of facilities that will take the the natural gas and produce polyethylene, polypropylene, fertilizer, et cetera. So that alone is going to be hundreds of thousands of jobs, and those are factories that would have otherwise been in the Middle East or other places where cost of natural gas is comparable to what we have here today. So clearly, if you think of energy as a raw material to produce something with, clearly there's been a lot of reshoring as a result. You know? And FDI, a lot of foreign companies, this may be half foreign, half U.S. When you look at energy as a cost in producing other things, so energy as to the cost to heat steel, to melt steel, or to run a machine tool or an air conditioning factory, the best data I can get is that on average, energy is only about 2% of manufacturing cost. Okay, and so if it were free, the most you do is cut your manufacturing cost by 2%, and it's not free. So that's not to say it isn't important. And when you look down, like we have a study that was done for us by BLS, Biggins, Lacey, Shapiro, the site selection firm, and they compared Chinese electricity costs to U.S. electricity costs, and they have it by U.S. state, major states, and major Chinese cities, and the Chinese cost is 50 to 100% higher than in the U.S. So it's a significant, it's an important, it's not a thing there, and so any of you, I would encourage to look at that BLS, Biggins, Lacey, Shapiro site, and find that data, or contact me and I could send you a copy of the study. So we think it's important. Also with Department of Energy, I've had some communications with your office. You've had a contest on innovation, getting people to produce things here after they're innovated or after they're designed, instead of having them immediately go off to China. And I've done some collaboration with that group. So what we find is that entrepreneur invents a new widget, and the venture capitalist said, China, China, instantly China. And we say, well, that's the worst possible time to be there, because you're making the prototypes. You want to have somebody right next door to you that you can work on each iteration, work on the product and the process together. So the dumbest time is to go immediately abroad. Smart thing is to make it here for at least 5 years. Get your R&D tax credit after I get the bill changed, and then maybe for supplying Asia, you put the factory into China, for example. Yeah.
I run that prize. We're announcing the winners next week.
Yeah, other questions?
You might want to measure how many of your companies go to Shenzhen because they get the money. They have about 450 incubators. They have support of a broad-ranging ecosystem is taken seriously, whereas we think something like the market will solve all that, and it's not. So which gets me to another question. I think one of the things you need to advocate here is an institutional solution. Sure, I can stand up too. That is to have some place where there's a focus, an interagency group that would actually be focused on manufacturing and take this comprehensive approach that you're describing. We don't have anyone that does that. In fact, DOE's job is to compete with the Commerce Department and not cooperate when possible. No, I'm dead serious. And DOD is schizophrenic as well. They have needs, but they don't want anyone else using their money. So you have tensions in the manufacturing USA program. Also, we're going to get it all done. I think it's only another 18 months before they're completely up and everyone's happy and they're all making money, which is something that the Fraunhofer Institutes that you don't mention haven't done in the last 50 years. A country, a third of our economy, puts in about $2.5 billion a year just focused on manufacturing. We don't get anywhere near that. So my point is, I think you have a whole series of really interesting things. You didn't mention a reason to go offshore is that if you actually want to sell into the Chinese market. And you know the deal, if they have something good, they ship it to us, and if we have something good, we ship the factory, because otherwise you can't sell. And I think that's obviously a major impediment. I think, by the way, I think your analysis, I want to stress, is the full cost analysis is one that deserves a great deal more of attention. But underlying that is that there's a lack of focus. The Department of Defense procures overseas because we don't have it here until they ask the Manufacturing Extension Program, which can identify the 5 or 6 companies that actually make it. But we have this sort of knee-jerk reaction. So I just, having just been in Shenzhen, I feel I was visiting a professional football training team, and it's really great to be back here in high school.
So let me just comment on that a little bit. I think what I heard was there just needs to be more focus on manufacturing. So there logically, I'd say there logically should be a cabinet secretary of manufacturing or industry or something like that. At the least, there should be, like for reshoring, we have Select USA. Who knows what Select USA is? Okay, the office that's responsible for foreign direct investment. They're having their annual summit, June 20 to 22, out at the Gaylord National, and I'll be there if any of you are there. And they do an excellent job on bringing FDI to the country, but they're interested. Like I meet with them frequently, and they're interested in research. They're interested in our tools because the tool applies to the FDI case as well as it does to the U.S. case. But they're 95% FDI, maybe 5% reshoring, and so one congressman at least has proposed written a bill to add reshoring as an equal responsibility for Select USA or some other office within Commerce. And I think that, to me, it's so obvious that it should be done, and so we obviously would support it.
They don't have the tools. Any other country can provide subsidies at the national level.
Yeah, and nothing is done at the national level here. It's all done at the state and local level. Yeah, see, let them find a state and local level.
Just for your question, so you mentioned the Fraunhofer model. Actually, we have a Manufacturing USA, which is a similar version of Fraunhofer model. Right now, we have 14 institutes, and next year maybe 15 or 16 institutes. Very similar is to bridge the gap between fundamental research and applied research, and provide viable technology to industry.
That's right. I helped advise the department on setting them up. Because I don't know what economists do, but they don't work on the front office of the national academies. We did some studies that capture that. But you have a virtual system. You have a 3 to 5 year joke system where somehow you're supposed to become. It's a great initiative. It's supposed to become self-sustaining. So that means by 18 to 2 years out, you start losing people because they don't see where the funds are going to come from. One of the directors, when we did our research in Germany, we cheated. We actually went to them instead of doing a blog overnight. And one of the directors said, "You just don't understand how it works. We provide roads, we provide railways. Railway is something that has trains on it, for stuff. And we provide electricity, and we provide the front office. That's what we do. That's just part of our state supply. We don't understand that here. We don't want to pick winners. We want other countries to pick winners. Which they do, and their main winner is their national economy, which is why this is important."
Len?
Harry, another thing, having a national view, I work all over the country with a lot of distressed communities, and I think we need to get manufacturing back into the distressed communities because that's where people really want jobs, really need jobs. Unemployment is much higher than the national average, and if we keep putting factories back into communities that are already built out, of course we're going to have labor shortages. So I think we need to put a focus on that too. So I like your idea of the interagency approach and get the Department of Labor in there talking about that as well.
Well, you got a question over here? Okay.
So I think we have time for one more question here. Good morning. My name is Rosemary Segera. I'm a president of a company called Segeros International Group. We focus on small and medium businesses and small and medium manufacturing. Just looking at your presentation, thank you so much for your wonderful presentation. How are the small and medium businesses going to be very competitive comparing to offshore? And if they are to be manufacturing locally here, is there a way when a small and medium manufacturer from another country that wants to invest in the U.S. In a manufacturing plant, what would be the incentives or what would be the?
So how to get more small to medium-sized company involved? So we would say, as I presented with that case with Maury Corp, they're a small to medium-sized company, depending on your definition of medium, and they used our TCO tool to convince their big customer to buy from them instead of from China. So to take all those small to medium-sized companies and convince them as salesmen, their salesmen, when they talk to the big customer, to talk total cost instead of price. The first 5 of them that come in, the salesman, the customer may say, I don't want to hear about it. But eventually, someone will come in that buys the football tickets or takes them to dinner or does whatever, and eventually that buyer will listen. If he hears it from enough people, then eventually those companies will start to buy on total cost, and the companies will succeed. To get the foreign companies to invest here, let's see, second, as the companies here get busier, and as the manufacturing improves, and it's more clear that manufacturing is improving, it'll get easier to recruit the skilled workforce, which is such a big problem. And they'll have the money to do the investment to be productive enough to bring the work back. So foreign companies, I suggested our program to identify what the niches are, the areas where there's supply chain gaps, and then going abroad and getting those foreign companies to come over here and invest. So I think there's excellent possibilities. And when you hear when I hear the analysis, we read the analysis of the impacts of offshoring, they talk a lot, like I said, a lot about the workers and nowhere near enough about the small to medium-sized companies that were destroyed. And so as things come back, those should be the logical growth opportunities. And since many of those companies are just totally gone, then what we'll do is create entrepreneurial opportunities because the smart machinist, the smart welder, the smart investment person will start their own company and will come back again and start up that equivalent of the German Mittelstand, and that's an absolutely essential backbone for our manufacturing economy.